Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history, as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is focused on the Hoover Commission, the original DOGE. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, a capability that President Trump is bringing into his second term. The intent is to slash trillions of dollars in expenditures, make government operations more efficient, maybe shrink the size of government, nothing off the table. And the question is, well, has anybody ever tried this before? And the fact is, it has been tried many, many times, and usually unsuccessfully. Politics almost always getting in the way of these kinds of efforts. But in this case, there was one example that maybe the DOGE folks can look back on, and that was the commission set up under Herbert Hoover, the former president in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. This is really the one success story when it comes to one of these commissions focused on the efficiency of government. Here's how it came about. Franklin Roosevelt passed away in April of 1945, just a couple of months into his fourth term. The vice president, Harry Truman, assumes the presidency and carries the United States forward over the next several months to the conclusion of World War II. Part of that was there was the possibility of starvation in Europe in the wake of the devastation going on across the continent. And for that, Truman actually went to the only living ex-president, Herbert Hoover, to see if he could help out. Hoover, after all, was the expert on starvation and wars. He had basically helped almost single-handedly start the effort to save Belgium from starvation in World War I. Also during World War I, he had become the United States food administrator to basically feed the troops, the Allies, and eventually Europe after the fact. He was the expert on food and starvation in these massive kinds of efforts. So what did Truman want? Help us out here in the wake of World War II. Now, Hoover had been a political pariah. He had been derided by the Democrats for a decade and a half, blaming Hoover for almost all the economic ills in the country, from the Great Depression and so on. But for now, Truman thought he could help, and Hoover was thrilled with the chance to do so. So now we fast forward a couple of years, and Truman is faced with basically chaos in the executive branch of government. The government had gotten really kind of out of control from the New Deal through World War II. A lot of temporary organizations were scattered throughout the government. At the time when Hoover was president in the late 1920s, there were about 350 agencies in the federal government and about 600,000 federal employees. Just a couple of decades later, that had ballooned to 1,800 agencies, 2 million federal employees, lots of confusion about who reported to who. Truman thought this was a chance to let's get our arms around this and get rid of the chaos and have a much more efficient government. Congress gets on board by passing and authorizing the Commission on the Organization of the Executive Branch of Government with some specific goals: limiting expenditures to the lowest amount consistent with efficient performance, eliminating duplication, consolidating services, abolishing services not necessary, and defining and limiting executive functions. Truman knew these kinds of things weren't easy. They had to be done on a bipartisan basis if they were going to be successful. In fact, he said, we're going to start this in 1948, which was an election year, but I don't want to see the results or recommendations until after the election. Let's try to keep politics out of this. And for this, Truman needed a leader. And for that, he went across the aisle again to the former president, Herbert Hoover, and asked him to lead. He told Hoover that, look, we can really accomplish some good results as you and I are fully acquainted with what is necessary to make government run more efficiently. It's kind of an odd couple, Truman and Hoover, but they got together on this topic. And Hoover, again, wasn't doing all that well physically. He's 74 years old. He had just had a bad case of the shingles, but look, this was right up his alley. The man they used to call the great engineer from the days in his earlier parts of his career. Efficiency basically was his middle name, and he was ready to dive into the work. 20 months of effort, 19 task forces, about 300 experts. Hoover recruited practically all of them, and he was that single node that really kept this commission going step after step. What did they do? Lots of recommendations. 30 government enterprises they recommended that they liquidate, and they consolidated a lot of activities into single places. For example, all public works went to the Interior Department. All the major land agencies were realigned in the Agriculture Department. Lending agencies in the Treasury Department. The State Department functions were very much narrow. They decided to take sort of a mishmash of organizations and create a new cabinet agency. The recommendation was an agency focused on the health, education, and welfare activities for the American people. A new agency called the Office of General Services, now called the General Services Administration, to centralize supply, records management, building management, all again for efficiency, and to even reorganize the Post Office Department on a business basis, trying to take politics out of that. Traditionally, the Postmaster General had always been a political person, mainly for the patronage opportunities to hand out jobs around the country. Recommendations here, let's make that more on a business basis and have the Postmaster General no longer be a political in that kind of regard. Well, how did all this come together? Well, there was no Twitter at the time, but it took a big push of publicity, and once again, Hoover was leading the way. He gave speeches on the radio, speeches in person, congressional testimony, strong support from President Truman. They really were very much aligned here in looking at the 270 some odd recommendations that were being made, and in this case, they came out with those recommendations after the election. Truman narrowly re-elected, had some momentum on his side, said, now's the time. Let's put those recommendations on the table, and Congress and the executive branch both had opportunities to implement these changes, and more than 70% of the recommendations from the Hoover Commission were actually adopted. Major change, push for efficiency across the federal government, and a lot of credit went to Herbert Hoover, including this note from Collier's, calling it an exhausting as well as exhaustive labor that has won him the gratitude and respect of the entire country, kind of a complete about-face in the reputation of Herbert Hoover, and a major change in the efficiency activities related to the executive branch of government. Well, it went so well that when Dwight Eisenhower became the president and elected in 1952 to succeed Truman, he's now a Republican in office, he wanted to continue the effort. He called for another commission, a second Hoover Commission in this case, not just on reorganizing and looking at efficiencies, but actually questioning the role of government itself. What should the federal government be involved in, and maybe areas that it should not be involved in that it currently has activities. Hoover, for him, this was very much a philosophical argument, that it wasn't as much in his first commission, but very much in the second. Our purpose must be to restore the vitality and responsibility of local government in the administration of these projects, Hoover said. By doing so, we can give release of the states from federal dictation and remove taints of socialism. He would later add, the government should provide those services which the people cannot do for themselves. Hoover, for a long time, had been criticizing Roosevelt and the New Deal taking on these socialistic tendencies. He said, look, we're through those crises, better or worse, let's go back to sort of the way we were. American individualism is what Hoover called it, trying to, again, understand the role of the federal government, where it should be, and also where it should not be. Well, the commission was established in 1953, went on for a couple of years. 300 recommendations came out of the second Hoover Commission, eliminating a lot of programs that, again, the commission felt should be better suited to be delivered by the private sector. Also reforming the Bureau of the Budget, control spending further. Also some reorganization of the new Defense Department was part of this. Strengthening and further professionalizing the civil service, part of the recommendations from Hoover. One of the most controversial areas was public power, and this was long something that Roosevelt and Hoover had gone back and forth on. For Hoover's sense, it was okay for the federal government to invest the huge amounts of capital necessary to create power generation, like the Hoover Dam that was named for Hoover in Nevada, also for conservation purposes. For those areas, again, federal government appropriate, but he always drew the line at power distribution. He thought that should belong to the private sector, and so they tried to make some recommendations along these lines as well. The problem was this was a tougher sell. Yes, a Republican administration is in place, but the Democrats took over Congress in the midterms. Less bipartisan feeling at this point, more sort of political overtones and resistance related to Hoover's second commission. Frankly, on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, including in the executive branch, where Hoover said, look, from the tenacity of government agencies to the idea that their empires are sacrosanct, came pushback. In this case, in the second Hoover Commission, only about 30% of their recommendations were adopted. Hoover wasn't very happy about this. He partially blamed Eisenhower for not being aggressive enough in pushing things, but frankly, Eisenhower didn't have the votes. There have been other commissions that have been tried over the years, modest success at best. The barriers to reform are significant. They are political. They sit in the executive branch, the legislative branch. Some of these things have very strong constituencies, and even if they're not efficient, the government tends to perpetuate. It just makes this hard. We had this one case, though, where Democrats and Republicans came together. A Democratic president in Harry Truman, a Republican, a former president in Herbert Hoover, a bipartisan commission, extremely extremely rare and it was effective. But even Hoover found out sometimes those political windows are short-lived. The second Hoover Commission, not nearly as successful, but if the DOGE folks want something to look at as one example where this has really worked in American history, go back to the 1940s, the late 1940s, and the first Hoover Commission. By the way, a little bit more on the remarkable career of Herbert Hoover. If you're interested in that, check out some of the links below in the description, some of the other episodes from Presidential Chronicles. For now, that is a look at the Hoover Commission, the original DOGE. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspective from Presidential Chronicles.